That takes us just past 8:08 in the morning. You're listening to Upfront. I'm Brian Edwards-Teekert. We're going to turn back to the state capitol. There's a bill making its way through the legislature. It's currently sitting in the Appropriations Committee in the Assembly. That kind of takes on a new frontier of policymaking. This is Assembly Bill 2408, which is trying to address the impacts that some of the most popular social platforms in the world have on the mental health of children who use them. What it would specifically do is bar large platform companies with over $100 million a year in revenues, from using features that they know or reasonably should know cause children to become addicted to their products. It puts it up to public prosecutors to actually enforce that. It's not a free-for-all for civil litigation. And it creates a safe harbor for companies that set up a quarterly internal audit process and follow up on the results of those audits. Since this is a relatively new frontier of policymaking in the state that plays host to the tech capital of the world, we thought this would be a useful time to have a pro-con. On the pro side of AB 2408, we have Ed Howard, who's Senior Policy Advocate for the Children's Advocacy Institute. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
And on the con side, Tepring Picado, Senior Director of State and Local Government Relations for the Western U.S. at the Chamber of Progress. Chamber of Progress is a trade group financed by tech companies. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you.
So, Ed Howard, we'll start with you because you're backing the bill. Give us an example. What kind of problem are you trying to fix?
Well, we're trying to fix a really completely unprecedented crisis in teen mental health. If you look at the data between about 2000 and between 2011, rates of suicide, major depression, self-poisoning, the real scary canaries in the coal mines for teen mental health were relatively consistent. But beginning in 2011, especially among teen girls, you see an uptick in suicide, self-harm, and major depression that's in some charts almost straight up. It's like nothing anybody has ever seen before. Our children are literally on fire when it comes to mental health. And a now very solid record of academic research, Facebook's own leaked research about its impact on Instagram, quote, "We make body image worse for 1 in 3 teen girls," end quote, from their own research. An addict's narrative, quote unquote, is what its own research described a significant number of its Instagram users. Between the experience of clinicians out there on the ground who are seeing the wreckage of this generation and its relationship to social media, the experience of an increasing number of helpless parents, and I think most poignantly, the number of kids themselves who are now crying out for help. A significant number of them self-identifying Instagram's own research as being addicted. And then finally, as a result of all of this, you've got this very unusual and passionate bipartisan consensus that something has to be done. And at minimum, we all think, the many supporters of the bill,
let's talk about the something, because I want to bring Dr.
The
Picado into the conversation
addiction,
momentarily.
yeah.
Can you give me Ed Howard, can you give me an example of a feature on a platform like Instagram that you would expect to be removed if this bill were implemented? Like, what are you actually talking about taking off the board here?
Well, there's not a particular, I can tell you what the research shows are the features that are most correlated to addiction, the ones that most closely resemble, for example, gambling. But
don't give me a laundry list, because we got to bring our other guest in. But give me one example.
Auto scroll, where you're constantly online. There are no cues that tell you how long you've been on. The reason they do that is for the same reason that casinos don't have clocks or windows. It's designed specifically to hide the fact of how long you've been on. I'll just throw that one example.
Okay, that's a great example. Let's bring into the conversation Tepring Picado from the U.S. Chamber of Progress. What's your problem with the bill, AB 2408?
Great, thank you. I welcome today's conversation about AB 2408. So the question isn't whether digital media is harming our children. The question is, how do we help these children who are reporting addiction? And this bill is not the right way to fix the problem. Our primary concern with AB 24 is that it has major flaws. It's going to end up limiting young users' access to major social media platforms, as you described, and ultimately, we believe, drive our children that we're seeking to protect toward less responsible, dangerous social media platforms that don't moderate content, don't have the same safeguards in place for kids. So the question, again, isn't should we be protecting our children? Absolutely, vulnerable population. The question we should be asking is how do we best protect our children from harm? And this bill, we've brought up auto scrolling. There are other aspects that our kids are going to be driven to, other platforms that our kids are going to be driven to that don't take a responsible approach. Just for one example, there's a platform called Omegle. It's a chat platform that connects its users, its child users, with strangers around the globe on video chat. It has 66 million users around the world, but this bill would not include them because, as you mentioned, there's a $100 million revenue threshold, and Omegle doesn't yet reach that. So our children can have access to that, but blocking YouTube Kids. YouTube Kids,
Right.
I don't know if you're familiar, provides curated experiences and protects young kids. So it's not that we're thinking about...
So I want to clarify the argument here. Your argument is that a company confronted with this legislation, rather than shutting off a feature like auto scroll, would just lock out kids and drive them to another platform?
So yes, so it's not going to be so easy to identify features. There's no working group. Other legislation that is seeking to protect children does have a working group to identify problematic features, to identify age-appropriate design. And this bill doesn't have anything like that. So there's no way to say that features will be identified for companies just to shut up.
Well, let's put that to you, Ed Howard, for a response. First of all, what's the rationale for that $100 million in revenues cutoff? Why only target the big platforms?
Well, because something like 70% of the eyes that are on social media during the day go through one company, a company that made $39 billion in net profit last year, which they've rebranded Meta, but we all know as Facebook. So we tend to try and legislate modestly in areas where we know there's the problem and not in areas where we don't know the problem, number one. And number two, the state is restrained because of federal law in its ability to be able to regulate the content that is delivered to kids. So what we can do, and what the bill does do, is extremely straightforward. If you think it should be legal for social media giants knowingly or carelessly to make addicts of child users, you should vote against this bill. But if you think it should be illegal for social media giants to knowingly or carelessly make addicts of their child users, you should support this bill. The rest of the bill is designed to try and motivate these companies away from the profits that come from child addiction toward doing the right thing. And that's the reason why there's an unprecedented safe harbor in the bill that simply says, look, if you monitor your stuff, if you monitor what you're doing, and we know that they can, because Facebook's own disclosed research shows that they can monitor it and shows they can identify when addiction becomes a problem. If you do that, and you find that you're addicting kids and you cut it out within 30 days, you don't have to pay any of the penalties at all under the bill. The bill's about motivating companies that otherwise have a financial incentive to keep as many eyes for as long as possible, even up to the risk of admitted addictions, an addiction narrative from Facebook, to try and give them a different kind of incentive. And as for the
great. Let's take that back to Tepring
Sure.
Picado. Let's.
Thank you.
Dr. Picado, you said you agreed. You said you hold on. You said you agreed with the policy goals, and the flaw that you identified was this big company threshold. So I just want to be clear. If there wasn't the $100 million revenues cutoff in the bill, is this legislation that you would be supporting or neutral on?
No, it still has policy design flaws, and actually.
Okay, so it sounds like we're not talking about your core objection then. So why don't we get into that?
The better approach is doing it in the front end. So taking a age-appropriate design approach, and these authors, Assemblymember Cunningham and Wicks, also have another bill that we believe is doing it a better way. And that's AB 2273. It's taking a design approach, thinking about before you engage with users, children and adults. But this is, particularly regulating the industry and protecting children from an age-appropriate design matter. So that's the fundamental aspect, is that it's important to protect children. This is 2408 is a flawed way to protect children. 2273 is a better way to protect children. California is a leader in this conversation, and thinking about it before it actually harms children is a better approach than after children are possibly harmed.
Yeah. I am curious, the tech companies you work with and that you're funded by, the ones with social platforms, they compete. They're in an attention economy. They're in competition for basically our eyeballs and eardrums during the hours that we're awake. Isn't there a benefit for the more scrupulous companies to have some kind of regulatory standard that prevents them from losing market share in a race to the bottom on who's willing to do the most unhinged things to grab kids' attention?
I believe that I know that the largest online platforms are actually taking great steps to protect our users online. Meta has collaborated with the Child Mind Institute and Connect Safely to think about a parent's guide to educate our parents on how to protect their children and provide safety tools in privacy settings. And there is a distinguishing feature between 6 and 7-year-olds and 16 and 17-year-olds, and that 2408 doesn't make that distinction. So these companies are making unprecedented self-regulation, and again, in AB 2273, which looks at it from a design approach prior to rolling out features, there is an acceptance of having that regulatory oversight and collaboration and working groups with professionals in the field, including those children advocacy groups.
I am not read up on AB 2273, but Ed Howard, I'll put that to you. What's your feeling about the bill and why it's not sufficient by itself?
Well, 2273, first of all, is about kids' privacy. It is not about the medical condition of addiction. The second is the tech industry still opposes 2273. Now they're using it because it doesn't have the kind of enforcement mechanism or because it doesn't clearly make one bad thing illegal, like addiction. They're using 2273 as kind of a stalking horse for 2408, so they can tell members, look, you can cover your South Pole by voting yes on this and just take a walk on 2408, but they're very different bills. And the third thing, in addition to the fact that the tech industry still opposes it, or at least large parts of it do, is that this is actually the first time in the entire duration of this bill that anybody from industry has actually made a constructive suggestion about what they would like to see in 2408, because the order so far has just been to kill it. And we are absolutely, repeatedly, our author went out and asked for suggested amendments. If, in fact, the Chamber of Progress would still agree that addiction should be illegal as medically defined, but would like some sort of amendments that require a collaborative process, some best practices, so long as we still maintain that the bottom line of knowing addiction is illegal, we would welcome that conversation with them. it's just been that the raw politics in Sacramento has been that we'll talk up, even while officially opposing, we'll talk up 2273, a very good bill, a welcome bill, a bill that should pass. We'll confuse the issue between privacy and addiction, and will at all costs, without even discussing amendments with the author, try and kill 2408. Because they want to look from a selfish business perspective. If you could continue to make money by addiction, you would
sure. One second.
Continue to do it.
Thank you.
Dr. Picotto?
Just a point of clarification, I have spoken to the author's office on a number of times, and I have provided suggestions and had great conversations with his office. So I just want to make that clear. My experience is as a policy professor, policy design, ethics, and a policy and action course. And part of my background is that I absolutely think about amendments first and the intent of the author's intent, and work from there. And so this bill has particular policy flaws, which includes exemptions for video games, which cause addiction. It has this revenue threshold, which is not a clear policy mechanism either. Why are smaller revenue platforms not included? And the responsibility of liability for companies that don't have full control over the causation of addiction is all problematic. So happy to have this discussion. I'm thankful for Assemblymember Cunningham's leadership in this, and moving forward, I welcome the conversation about 2273 and why I think that's a better that will protect children as well.
Ed Howard, let me turn that into a bigger picture question. Why isn't this legislation in more expansive form? Why are addictive design features only a problem for children on social platforms and not in video games or when targeting adults?
Because we haven't seen in the data or in the clinical experience the kind of causation / correlation between video games or anything else as we have with social media. And in part because, so take an example, right? The data on queer kids being bullied. Well, the data on queer kids being bullied online is overwhelming. It's a source of community for queer kids when social media is working, but it is also a place where they are routinely bullied. Now imagine being chemically, clinically addicted to the very source of your torment. And it's the same with sexual trafficking. It's the same with kids of color being fed bad food. It's the case of we make body image worse for 1 in 3 girls. So we legislate where we know the problem really is. And when it comes to that unprecedented crisis that we're in right now, the data and the clinical experience all point to social media. And as for the amendments, I've never seen anything in writing that proposes a single amendment from anybody in the opposition on this bill, and I would welcome it.
That's the voice of Ed Howard, Senior Policy Advocate at the Children's Advocacy Institute, backing Assembly Bill 2408, which would outlaw features on large social platforms established to have addictive properties for children. We gave him the first word, so we'll go to you, Tepring Picotto, for the last.
Great. I just want to end with, the Chamber of Progress is a tech industry association that works to ensure that all Americans benefit from technological leaps. And one of our top priorities is to promote safe and healthy online communities. And we've become known as a leading advocate for those laws that allow social media platforms to remove the dangerous content and also allow a thriving community that benefits children and people of all ages.
That's Tepring Picotto, Senior Director of State and Local Government Relations for the Western U.S. at the Chamber of Progress. That is a tech industry trade organization. Thank you, both of you, for speaking to us this morning.